Warning disclaimer warning: this video contains a completely fictional story created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, events, or situations is purely coincidental. This content is not based on real facts and should not be interpreted as truth. Viewer discretion is advised. Chuck Norris adjusted his baseball cap as he stepped through the doors of the McDonald's, the familiar scent of sizzling fries and grilled burgers wrapping around him like an old memory. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet stop, just a quick meal before heading to a charity event later that evening. Outside, the Texas sun blazed in the afternoon sky, casting golden light across the parking lot. Inside, the restaurant was alive with movement. Families sat in booths, dipping fries into little paper cups of ketchup. Teenagers clustered near the drink station, laughing between sips of their oversized sodas. A mother wrestled with a crying toddler, offering him a toy from a Happy Meal box in desperation. Chuck had been in the spotlight for decades, yet he still found moments like this refreshing. Just normal, everyday people living their lives. He didn't mind when a few customers did double takes, their eyes widening in recognition. Some whispered to their friends, but nobody rushed over. He appreciated that. Fame had never been his goal. It was just a byproduct of doing what he loved. And even though he had played the toughest warriors on screen, he always preferred moments of peace. He reached for a napkin from the dispenser, preparing to enjoy his meal, when something unexpected happened. A small, hesitant tug at his sleeve. Chuck turned his head. At first, all he saw was a little blonde-haired boy, no older than 5, standing beside him. His wide, frightened blue eyes locked onto Chuck's, pleading but silent. His face was pale, too pale for a child who should have been giddy over French fries and chocolate milkshakes. Chuck immediately noticed the way the boy's tiny fingers clenched at his sleeve, as if he were holding onto the fabric for dear life. His chest rose and fell with quick, panicked breaths. Something was wrong. Chuck crouched slightly, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. He had always been good with kids, whether it was training young martial artists or spending time with his own grandkids. His voice was steady, gentle. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" The boy swallowed hard. His gaze darted around the restaurant, his little body trembling like a leaf in the wind. Finally, he leaned in close, so close that Chuck could feel the warmth of his breath as he whispered something so soft, so fragile. It was almost lost beneath the hum of the restaurant. Chuck froze. His stomach twisted. His heart, usually steady, even in the most dangerous of situations, skipped a beat. The color drained from his face. His legendary calm, the same unshakable composure that had seen him through countless battles on and off screen, wavered. He had faced criminals, soldiers, and assassins. He had trained in combat for decades, but nothing had ever made him feel the cold dread that crept through his chest in that moment. Chuck Norris was not an easy man to shake, but this was different. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he dialed 911. A woman's voice answered almost instantly. "911, what's your emergency?" Chuck's voice, usually warm and rich with humor, was clipped and urgent. "This is Chuck Norris. I need immediate police assistance at the McDonald's on Main Street and 5th. It's an emergency." A brief pause. Then, a quick, professional response. "Sir, can you confirm the nature of the emergency?" Chuck glanced down at the little boy, whose fingers were still gripping his sleeve, his tiny knuckles white. The child was shaking but hadn't shed a single tear. That kind of fear, the kind that freezes a child instead of making them cry, that was what terrified Chuck the most. His eyes flicked toward the far end of the restaurant. His jaw tightened. "There's a man here," he said quietly, his tone darker now. "He's dangerous. And this boy just told me that his little sister is in the trunk of his car." The operator sucked in a breath. A hush fell over the space around them. The people closest to Chuck sensed something was wrong. A mother at a nearby booth instinctively pulled her children closer. An older couple, midway through their meal, exchanged concerned glances. Even the cashier behind the counter paused, her hands frozen over the register. Chuck kept his focus razor sharp. Units are on their way, the operator confirmed. Can you describe the suspect? Chuck's instincts, honed over decades of training and real-world experience, had already locked onto him. At a corner table, near the back of the restaurant, sat a man in a gray hoodie. He was stirring his coffee absently, but his posture was too rigid, too controlled. His fingers were wrapped so tightly around the cup that the styrofoam dented beneath the pressure. His foot tapped rapidly against the tile floor, his entire body humming with nervous energy. Every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the exit. Chuck knew that kind of body language. He had seen it before in criminals, in men on the run, in people with dark secrets to hide. Predators, the kind that operated in shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And today, this predator had made a fatal mistake. Because today, Chuck Norris was here. The air in the McDonald's seemed to grow heavy with tension, like the charged silence before a storm. Chuck placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. He could feel the little one trembling beneath his grip. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice low. The boy hesitated before answering. "Liam." "You're doing great, Liam." Chuck squeezed his shoulder gently. "Your sister, what's her name?" A tear finally slipped down the child's cheek as he whispered, "Emma." Chuck nodded. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. "Don't worry, Liam," he promised. "We're getting her back." The boy didn't say anything, but the way his tiny fingers tightened on Chuck's sleeve, gripping it as if it were the only solid thing left in his world, spoke volumes. Across the restaurant, the man in the hoodie shifted in his seat. His eyes locked onto Chuck, and in that moment, the predator knew. He had been seen. A choice flashed across his face, fight or flee. And Chuck Norris, muscles coiled, heart hammering, knew exactly what was about to happen. The storm was coming, and he was ready for it. The air inside the McDonald's was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Chuck Norris didn't move, yet. He didn't need to. Years of training had taught him the value of patience, the importance of reading an opponent before striking. The man in the gray hoodie had gone rigid. His fingers twitched, his eyes darted toward the exit, then back at Chuck. He knew. He knew that the moment Chuck had called 911, his time was running out. Chuck could see the wheels turning in the man's head. Run? Fight? Talk his way out of it. He had no idea who he was up against. And that was his first mistake. Chuck subtly shifted his stance. His movements were casual, barely noticeable to anyone not trained to look for them. But if the man tried to bolt, Chuck would be on him in an instant. Liam still clung to his sleeve, his tiny hand shaking. Chuck knelt slightly, keeping one eye on the suspect while lowering his voice. "Liam, listen to me," he said gently. "I need you to do something very important. I need you to go to the counter and stand next to that lady in the red shirt." He nodded toward a cashier who had been watching nervously. "She's going to keep you safe." Liam's fingers tightened around Chuck's arm. But Chuck met his gaze, his expression unshakable. "I'll get Emma, I promise. But I need you to be brave one more time, okay?" The little boy hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. He released Chuck's sleeve, taking a shaky step back before hurrying toward the counter. The cashier, sensing something serious, reached for him instinctively, her expression shifting from confusion to fierce protectiveness. Chuck straightened. Now, his full attention was on the man in the hoodie. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The restaurant had fallen into an uneasy silence, with only the occasional beep of a fryer in the background. Other customers were starting to pick up on the atmosphere, whispering nervously. Then, the man did something stupid. He bolted. The chase begins. He shot up from his seat so fast that his chair toppled backward, crashing against the tile floor. Gasps erupted around the restaurant as he shoved past a family, knocking over a tray of food in his mad dash toward the door. But Chuck Norris was faster. Before the man could make it 3 steps, Chuck moved. Years of martial arts training, years of discipline and control. Every ounce of experience surged through his body in perfect synchronization. He lunged forward with a speed that defied his age, closing the distance between them in an instant. The man barely had time to react before Chuck's hand clamped onto his wrist like a steel vise. "Not so fast," Chuck growled. The suspect twisted, trying to break free, but Chuck was prepared. He shifted his grip, spinning the man's arm behind his back and forcing him forward. The suspect let out a strangled grunt of pain as Chuck slammed him face-first against a nearby booth. "Let me go, man," he hissed, struggling. Chuck leaned in, his voice a low, controlled whisper. "There's a little girl's life at stake. You're not going anywhere." People were backing away now, their eyes wide as they recognized just how serious this was. A young man fumbled for his phone, recording the scene. The suspect was panting, eyes wild, but Chuck could feel the adrenaline surging through him. He wasn't done fighting yet. And then, just as Chuck expected, he tried his next move. The man suddenly dropped his weight, wrenching himself sideways in an attempt to break free. He twisted his torso, his free hand reaching toward his waistband. Chuck saw it before it happened. A weapon. In a flash, Chuck reacted. Before the suspect could even grip the handle of whatever he was reaching for, Chuck struck. He delivered a sharp, precise elbow to the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The suspect gasped, doubling over just long enough for Chuck to twist him back into position. Then, with practiced ease, Chuck swept his leg behind the man's knee, sending him crashing to the floor. He landed hard, groaning in pain, but Chuck wasn't done. In one swift motion, he pinned the man's arm behind his back and pressed a knee into his shoulder, keeping him firmly restrained. All of this happened in mere seconds. The entire restaurant stood frozen in shock. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth. A teenage boy whispered, "Holy crap, that was so fast." Chuck barely heard them. He kept his weight steady on the man below him. "Where is she?" he demanded. The suspect coughed, trying to wriggle free. "I don't." Chuck applied just a little more pressure. "The trunk. Where's the car?" A second of hesitation. Then, the man exhaled sharply. "Oh, outside. Black sedan, parking lot, third row." Chuck wasted no time. He turned toward the wide-eyed cashier at the counter. "Call 911 again. Tell them to send paramedics. And tell them we found the girl." She nodded frantically, grabbing the phone. Chuck looked back down at the man beneath him. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but with urgency. If the girl had been locked in a trunk for too long, she might not have much time left. He couldn't wait for the police. He had to get to her now. The rescue without hesitation. Chuck released the suspect and sprang to his feet. A younger man, a customer in his mid-20s, rushed forward. "I'll hold him," the man said. His voice was nervous but determined. "Go." Chuck nodded once. Then, he turned and ran. The doors of the McDonald's swung open with force as he sprinted into the parking lot. The Texas heat hit him like a wall, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the rows of cars in an instant. There, a black sedan, exactly where the suspect had said. Chuck didn't slow down. He reached the car in seconds, yanking on the trunk handle. Locked. His jaw clenched. No time to look for keys. No time to be delicate. He stepped back and kicked. The force of his boot slammed into the trunk with the power of years of training behind it. The metal groaned, denting inward. But it wasn't enough. He kicked again, harder. This time, the latch snapped. The trunk popped open with a loud crack. And there, curled up inside, was a little girl. Emma. She was tiny, no older than 3. Her blonde hair was messy, her face streaked with tears. But the moment her wide, terrified eyes met Chuck's, she let out a choked, gasping sob. Chuck's heart squeezed in his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, instantly softening his tone. He reached in carefully, gently pulling her into his arms. "You're safe now. I got you." She whimpered, clinging to his shirt, her small body shaking. Chuck held her close. Then, from the distance, sirens. The police were here. And as Chuck Norris turned back toward the restaurant, holding Emma securely against his chest, he knew one thing for certain. He had kept his promise. Liam and Emma were safe. But it wasn't over yet. Because now, it was time to make sure the man who had done this never got another chance. The sirens screamed through the Texas afternoon, flashing red and blue lights cutting across the pavement like fire and ice. The weight of little Emma's trembling body in Chuck Norris' arms anchored him in the moment. She clung to him, her tiny fingers digging into his shirt, as if letting go would mean losing her safety all over again. "It's okay, sweetheart," Chuck murmured, his voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I've got you." She didn't respond with words, just a muffled sob into his chest. Chuck turned toward the restaurant as the first police officers stormed inside. The young man who had volunteered to hold the suspect had done his job well. The man in the hoodie lay on the floor, hands over his head, breathing heavily as two officers pinned him down and snapped cold metal cuffs around his wrists. "Suspect in custody," an officer radioed in. "We have a confirmed child abduction case." The customers, who had been frozen in suspense, now began murmuring in shock. Some wiped away tears. A mother hugged her children closer. A teenager whispered, "Did Chuck Norris just save a kid?" before fumbling to restart his phone's camera. But Chuck wasn't thinking about any of them. He was thinking about Liam. Reuniting a family, Liam stood just inside the restaurant, his small hands gripping the edge of the counter. His face was streaked with tears, his little chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He had been so brave, but now, seeing the flashing lights and the officers swarming around, he looked overwhelmed, lost. Chuck walked toward him slowly, Emma still cradled in his arms. "Liam," he called softly. The boy's head snapped up. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Liam's big blue eyes flicked from Chuck's face to the little bundle in his arms. His lips parted, breath catching in his throat. And then, "Emma." The boy bolted forward, his sneakers squeaking against the tile. Chuck knelt down just in time for Liam to throw his arms around his sister, his tiny body shaking as he sobbed into her tangled hair. I thought I lost you," he whispered between ragged breaths. Emma didn't say much. Maybe she was too exhausted, too young to fully understand what had happened. But her small hands reached for him, her face pressing into his shoulder. A quiet, desperate hug. Chuck swallowed hard. Even after everything he had seen, after all the battles, all the dangerous missions, all the villains he had defeated, this moment hit him harder than any punch ever could. This was why he fought. Not for fame, not for money, for moments like this, for the innocent, for kids like Liam and Emma, who deserved a world where they never had to be this afraid. "Justice is served," an officer approached, his badge catching the sunlight as he nodded at Chuck with deep respect. "Mr. Norris, I have to say, you just single-handedly took down a suspected kidnapper and saved 2 children." He shook his head in disbelief. "Hell of a job." Chuck gave a humble nod, adjusting his baseball cap. "Just doing what anyone else would have done." The officer smirked. "With all due respect, sir, I think only you would have done it that fast." Chuck let out a short chuckle. "Maybe." His expression turned serious again. "What's going to happen to him?" He nodded toward the suspect, who was now being hoisted off the ground by 2 cops. "He's got a record," the officer confirmed, flipping through some notes on his tablet. "Prior arrest for attempted abduction, but never enough evidence to keep him behind bars long enough." His jaw tightened. "This time, though, with everything you witnessed and that little boy's testimony, he won't be seeing daylight for a long time." Chuck exhaled. "Good." The officer hesitated, then looked toward Liam and Emma. "And the kids?" Just as Chuck was about to ask the same thing, a frantic voice called out, "Liam? Emma?" A woman burst through the crowd of officers, her face flushed with panic, her eyes darting wildly around, until they landed on the 2 little figures sitting on the curb. Liam's head shot up. "Mom!" The moment was electric. Liam sprang to his feet, Emma still in his arms, and ran straight toward her. The woman collapsed to her knees, gathering both of them in a desperate, tear-soaked hug. "Oh, my babies, she sobbed, stroking their hair, kissing their faces over and over. "I was so scared. I thought—" She choked on the words, unable to finish. Chuck felt his chest tighten. He didn't need to know the full story. The way she held them, the way she wept, the way her entire body shook with relief, it said everything. She had probably thought she would never see them again. And now, because of a little boy's courage and a timely intervention, she had them back. The officer beside Chuck sighed. Well, that's about the best ending we could have hoped for. Chuck simply nodded. The aftermath after everything had settled, Liam's mother approached Chuck. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady. You saved my children. Her eyes brimmed with gratitude. How do I even begin to thank you? Chuck glanced at Liam, who stood beside her, still holding Emma's hand protectively. The boy looked up at him, his expression filled with something new. Not fear, not sadness, respect, hope. Chuck smiled and knelt down. Liam, you were the real hero today. The little boy's eyes widened. Me? Chuck nodded. You were scared, but you didn't freeze. You didn't look away. You spoke up when it mattered most. That takes more courage than any action star could ever show on screen. Liam's lower lip quivered, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was pride. Chuck ruffled his hair. Remember that, okay? Never be afraid to do what's right. Liam nodded, his grip on Emma tightening just a little. Chuck stood back up, tipping his cap. You take care of them, ma'am. She sniffled, pressing a hand to her heart. I will. Thank you, Mr. Norris. Thank you. As Chuck turned to leave, he heard Liam's voice behind him. Mr. Norris? He stopped, looking back. The boy hesitated, then stood up a little taller. Thank you. Chuck gave him a small salute. And with that, he walked off, the sounds of sirens fading behind him, the warmth of a job well done settling deep in his chest. He hadn't planned to be a hero that day, but sometimes fate had a different plan. And if it meant saving a life, Chuck Norris would always answer the call.